Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very happy to see a lot of old friends here with us this morning. The quotation that the ambassador quoted from the former Chief Justice Barak of Israel Supreme Court actually goes on to say that Israel has to fight terror with one hand behind its back. One hand with a weapon in order to deal with terror, on the other hand, a limitation on the use of the weapon out of consideration for human rights and for the rights of the individual. And it's this issue of balance that the Deputy Prime Minister who spoke to you just now, this issue of balance that is the vital issue in all dealings with terror. Now, throughout my career, in addition to what was just introduced, I spent many, many years negotiating and drafting counter-terror conventions in the United Nations. I worked for 4 years as assistant legal counsel of the United Nations, and also as the representative of Israel in the UN Legal Committee, which drafted a large number of counter-terrorism conventions. And so it's incorrect to say that international law doesn't deal with terror. The question is, how does the international community use the balance between the need to deal with terror effectively, and on the other hand, the need to take into consideration basic human rights. And this is a dilemma that the international community hasn't been able to solve. And I intend to indicate to you during the next few minutes why this is so and what possible remedies could be adopted in order to change this. But first of all, terrorism is nothing new. The Hashashin, a name that gave us the word assassins, Hashashin, assassins, were a secretive Islamic sect active in Iran and Syria from the 11th to the 13th century. And their modus operandi was terror. Similarly, the Sikari were a first century group of Jews who acted against their enemies in a campaign to oust the Roman rulers from Judea. And if we want to come to more modern history, then the murder of Archduke Ferdinand, which heralded the First World War, was an act of terror. In other words, terror has always existed wherever there's been an aim to influence government or public actions through pressure on the general public and on innocent people in order to change policies or to change forms of governance. Now, there are different modes of terror. There's terror generated for specific territorial or national reasons. We've seen this over the years in Ireland. We've seen this in Spain. We're still seeing this in Spain. I was ambassador to Canada, as was the ambassador here today. We were both aware of the fact that during the violence conducted by Quebec to gain independence, terror was used, and they admit this. South Africa was also a sphere where terrorism was used. The aim to change a system of governance, not necessarily to change a whole character of a people. The other form or mode of terrorism is, of course, the terrorism generated out of ideology, and this is what was discussed by the Deputy Prime Minister this morning. And specifically, Muslim jihadist terror directed against the infidel, against the non-believer, against Christians, Jews, and anybody who's not Muslim, in furtherance of Islam. A very extreme interpretation of Islam, but nevertheless an interpretation which is growing amazingly over the past few years. And it has no territorial connotation specifically. And only last Sunday, Easter Sunday, if anybody followed what was happening in Lahore in Pakistan, where 72 Christians celebrating Easter in a park were brutally murdered, including 32 children. Or before that, Boko Haram in Nigeria murdered tens of Christians. Anybody who goes into the website of ISIS or Daesh, or however one wants to call it, look at the map that appears there, where all of Asia and all of the Middle East is part of the Islamic State, and Europe, Spain is Al-Andalus. I forget the name that they've given to Belgium, but and Holland, but it's all there. And this is a publicly available map published by the Islamic State. So it's not a question of whether in one particular area acts of violence can be justified by frustration or by poverty, as claimed by the Secretary General of the UN and by the President of the United States and the Foreign Affairs head of the European Union. It's not the case. The same terrorists who are running around in Jerusalem stabbing people and running over people come, and it's been proven, and there's papers that have been put out by my institute, the Institute for Contemporary Affairs in Jerusalem. It's been proven that they're from middle-class families, reasonably wealthy families. They've got no problem of frustration or poverty, but they are incited. And as soon as the incitement that the Jews want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque is used, and as soon as this is circulated on the web to millions and millions of people, then this is what drives terrorism. And it doesn't matter whether this is terrorism in Israel or this is terrorism in Turkey or in Belgium or in New York or anywhere else. It's the same terrorism. And it's high time that the international community comes to realize that this is the same type of terrorism. Now, I've spoken about different modes of terror. There are different forms of terror. There's state-inspired and state-implemented through hosting, training, arming, and enabling cross-border terror. We suffered it in the early years of Israel's existence by Fedayeen terrorists crossing over the borders from Egypt. In Jordan, the Fatah terrorists almost took over Jordan until King Hussein prevented it in 1971 in what was called Black September. In Lebanon and Syria, we've been seeing it for years and we're seeing it today. Hezbollah, which rules a part of Lebanon but is not the state of Lebanon, nevertheless is a terrorist organization. In addition to fighting the Syrians at the moment, or fighting the revolutionary elements in Syria, is also sponsoring acts of terrorism against Israel. And this is sponsored and financed and supported by Iran. The same with Hamas in the Sinai. And then we have, as I said, national liberation movements, Quebec, South Africa, Ireland, Spain, and Africa. And these same movements that I refer to, the quasi-state movements that indulge in jihadist terror, like Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, ISIS, they function with their own jihadist agendas, highly equipped and trained armies, even more well-equipped than existing armies. And then we have the individuals that I mentioned, the people who run around stabbing, road terror, suicide bombings, all influenced by the same ideology generated against the non-believer generated by incitement. And so the basic components of terror, there are two basic components. One is the ideological inclination, which goes through education, brainwashing, and incitement. And in addition to that, in order to complete the cycle, you have the availability, the supply, or the acquisition of weaponry in order to implement the ideology. And these two very basic components have to be together, because if you only have one, then it's just a question of ideology. Then the question is how to educate and change ideology. But on the second part, the provision of weaponry, the solution is to prevent or ensure that weaponry doesn't get into the hands of these type of people. Now, terror is dealt with in international law in various manners. Rather than condemning and criminalizing all terror, the international community has chosen to, first of all, deal with individual acts as they occurred in a series of action-orientated international conventions. And at the same time, to be politically correct, quote unquote, by always adding a reference to recognizing the causes of violence among local populations and calling upon governments to deal with the causes. And so we have 20 or so international counter-terror conventions, starting off in the 1963 Tokyo Convention on Offences Committed on Board Aircraft, the 1970 Hague Convention for Unlawful Seizure of Aircraft, and this was during the time when the aircraft terrorism, airline terrorism began. The 1971 Montreal Convention against unlawful acts against civil aviation, the 1973 UN Convention on Crimes against Internationally Protected Persons, the 1979 UN Hostages Convention, 1979 Vienna Nuclear Convention, 1988 Montreal Convention regarding terror against airports. And this, by the way, is the first time that the word terror appears in any of these conventions. There was always a sort of political correctness. Oh, we can't call this terror. By the way, this political correctness exists today. President Obama will never use the word terror in the context of Muslim terrorism. He'll never use the word Muslim either, but it's acts of violence. But until 1988, the word terror never appeared in any international convention. And then we have the Rome Protocol against fixed platforms on the continental shelf, and the 1991 Montreal Convention on marking plastic explosives, which I took part in drafting, the 1997 UN Terrorist Bombings Convention, which I also took part in drafting, the 1999 UN Financing Convention, the 2005 UN Convention on Nuclear Terrorism. Now, all these conventions were deliberately drafted in order to deal with specific actions, because it's possible to quantify specific actions and to criminalize them in local law, but not in international law. In other words, these conventions merely said member states who adopt these conventions are obligated to legislate and criminalize these type of acts within their own criminal legislation and to extradite where necessary or put on trial. But none of these crimes have become acknowledged international crimes of terrorism. When the Indians tried to bunch together all these international conventions into one comprehensive international convention, the Islamic states objected and blocked the attempt by the Indians to push this through the United Nations. Now, there are also regional conventions regarding terror, and there are some very interesting definitions. You have an Organization of African States Convention in 1971, the European Convention 1977, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation 87, Arab Convention 98, the Commonwealth of Independent States Convention 1999, Organization of Islamic Conference 1999, Shanghai 2001. In other words, there are a whole bunch of European and regional conventions dealing with terrorism, and it's quite interesting actually. They all define terrorism with some very effective and successful definitions. And let me just quote the definition of the Convention of the Organization of the Islamic Conference for Combating International Terrorism. Quote, terrorism means any act of violence or threat thereof, notwithstanding motives or intentions, perpetrated to carry out by an individual or collective a criminal plan with the aim of terrorizing people, or threatening to harm them, or imperiling their lives, honor, freedom, security, or rights, or exposing the environment or any facility, public or private property, to hazards, or occupying or seizing them, or endangering a natural resource, or international facilities, or threatening their stability, territorial integrity, political unity, sovereignty of independent states. Now, this is perhaps the best definition of terrorism that one can expect. And it comes from the Organization of Islamic States, and it was adopted by the Arab League. But of course, they added a second paragraph. And the second paragraph says, people's struggles, including armed struggle against foreign occupation, aggression, colonialism, hegemony, aimed at the liberation in accordance with the principles of international law, shall not be considered as terrorism as part of this definition. And so you've got this wonderful definition, but
I want to interrupt you for just a minute, because I'm not sure people understand. When you're talking about Islamic states, you don't mean the Islamic State, no, but you mean Muslim states.
Yes, this was before the Islamic State, ISIS, or ISIL, or Daesh came into existence. I'm talking about, this is 1999, in the good old days. So, the UN has tried over the years to deal with the problem of terrorism in international law. And from 1949, the UN attempted to draft a draft code of offenses against the peace and security of mankind. Because of the inter-bloc rivalry between the Soviet Union and the Americans, etc., there was never a possibility of coming to any agreement on any of these things. In 1972, the United Nations established an ad hoc committee on international terror in order to draft a comprehensive convention against terrorism. But of course, this resolution setting up the ad hoc committee added an article out of political correctness that reaffirmed the inalienable right to self-determination and the struggle of national liberation movements. In other words, on the one hand, yes, let's fight against terror, but of course, we can't harm or violate the inalienable right of liberation movements to struggle to get freedom. And this was always the balance or the proviso that was put into international attempts to criminalize terror. So the international community has attempted through treaties and resolutions to restrict the practical components of terror, as I explained, to engage states in not supporting, financing, assisting, encouraging terror, to restrict arms and funding, to encourage international cooperation and exchange of information, and to encourage criminal litigation within the national legal systems of individual states, and if they can't do it, then extradition to states that can do it. The international criminal tribunals of Yugoslavia, Rwanda, that were set up in 1993 and 1994, also are part of the development of international law to fight against international terrorism and war crimes in international law. And then, of course, the International Criminal Court, and I had the honor to be part of Israel's delegation negotiating and drafting the statute of the International Criminal Court. And this is another attempt to list terror as one of the international crimes, but they didn't succeed in doing it. And the initial Treaty of Rome from 1998 doesn't include a reference to terrorism. Terrorism was postponed to be negotiated during the course of the years. And now I want to come to the central message that I want to give here, and this is incitement. Because I opened by saying that incitement today has become a vital component of international terror. And what do I mean? Incitement today is the medium through which the ideology of terror actually materializes into the act of terror. Without circulation of the ideology and recruitment of support as a result of incitement, there wouldn't be terror. We're no longer seeing preaching on street corners, Hyde Park Corner in London, or in mosques, or flyers, or leaflets at political rallies. Today, you've got TV, you've got the internet, you've got social media, you've got the web, you've got WhatsApp. You've got means that can incite and manipulate millions of people at the press of a button. No effort, no problem. We only have to see what happened in Cairo the last few years, the Cairo demonstrations, which were generated by social media. The riots in Turkey and in Iran. The whole modus operandi, the way in which ISIS operates, is through social media and Al Jazeera and other television stations. As I said, the recent stabbing wave in Israel, it's based on false propaganda and incitement. And by the way, the problem of the plot of the Jews to attack Al-Aqsa has always been there since before the State of Israel existed. The riots organized by the Mufti in the 1920s were based on the canard that the Jews want to destroy Al-Aqsa. And some crazy Australian in the 1960s tried to burn Al-Aqsa. This became another reason for a whole new set of riots and killings and violence. So it's nothing new. But if indeed incitement is so obviously and clearly a central component of terrorism, the question still remains, why does the international community in general, and international law in particular, why have they never posited a crime of incitement to terror as such, or entertained an appropriate international convention among the various other counter-terrorism conventions? And it's difficult to rely on vague provisions in various conventions that prohibit supporting or encouraging acts that are prohibited in the convention, and where they see incitement as a notion of giving support or encouragement. Is it a justifiable response to claim that criminalizing incitement in an international convention would be endangering or violating First Amendment rights to free speech and therefore ultra-vires? And when I went to Washington to try and sell a draft international convention against incitement, which I will provide to you here, the one response was, no, we can't do that because it will be unconstitutional. It crosses the line between freedom of speech and human rights. Is it logical and tenable that a person who incites others to commit acts of terror, whether such a person is a preacher in a center for religious prayer, or a radio or television personality, a trade union activist, or a teacher in a school or college, or a political leader, can go scot-free after having played such a major role in generating acts of terror and bringing about the murder of thousands of people? Incitement in religious institutions through glorification of terrorists in the educational system, in kindergartens, schools, colleges, universities, through state or private political machinery, and most recently incitement and manipulation of the general adult community through the electronic media, it's become the major tactical weapon in the arsenal of certain governments and societies in advocating terror, violence, and hatred. We found this with the Palestinians, that only last week, Mahmoud Abbas praised the terrorists who've been running around stabbing Israelis at a memorial ceremony held in Ramallah. And this merely gives a green light. It's interpreted as giving a green light to continued acts of terror. And when the Secretary General of the UN comes out with a statement understanding the causes of terror, this is interpreted as giving a green light to continued terrorism. And so, when a weapon like Al Jazeera has the capability of inciting millions through televised images and nuanced reporting, all intended to rouse anger, hatred, and emotion, to cause riots and violence among the public, that has the capacity and the propensity to be incited, especially some elements of the public, and to turn to violence, and when this has the blessing of a religious authority instigating the incitement, then you have terror. The UN tried in a Security Council resolution in 2005 to act against incitement to terror. And it's a resolution that specifically, in its preambular paragraphs, refers to the need to condemn in the strongest terms incitement to terrorist acts and to repudiate attempts at the justification or glorification of terrorist acts that may incite further terrorist acts. It expresses concern that incitement of terrorist acts motivated by extremism and intolerance pose a serious and growing danger to the enjoyment of human rights, threaten social, economic development of states, undermine global stability and prosperity, and must be addressed urgently and proactively by the United Nations and all states. More importantly, this resolution emphasizes the need to take all necessary and appropriate measures in accordance with international law at the national and international level to adopt such measures as may be necessary and appropriate in order to carry out these obligations. But international law hasn't done this, hasn't acted to criminalize terror or incitement to terror. And since international law hasn't done it, then I decided to draft an international convention called the Draft International Convention for the Prevention and Incitement to Terror, and here it is. And I took this to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And this has been translated into Chinese, and it's been taken up by the Chinese government, who are interested in pushing it forward because they have a huge problem of Islamic jihadist terrorism within China, where thousands of Chinese are fighting in Syria and Iraq with ISIS. This is a standard UN convention. I deliberately drafted it in UN language, using all the preambular provisions, whereas this and whereas that, and taking into account this, citing all previous UN resolutions and UN treaties and conventions. The first article, I've tried to maintain the thin grey line between criminalizing incitement and not violating First Amendment rights so that the United States wouldn't have problems dealing with it. It's a very complex legalistic definition, but it's in there in the first article. The second article calls on states to legislate. The third article reaffirms human rights and obligations to maintain within the legal system and honor the human rights. The fourth article is very important because it determines that there can be no political justification for incitement to terror. The fifth and sixth article deal with supporting and financing means of inciting. The seventh article calls upon states to establish jurisdiction within their legal systems in order to prosecute. The ninth, 10th articles deal with extradition. The 11th, 12th, and the final articles deal with cooperation, exchange of information, and entry into force of this treaty. Nothing has been done yet. The United Nations hasn't really taken it very seriously, and so I'm going to leave you over lunch a series of copies of this convention, in addition to copies of a conference that I organized dealing with incitement to terror, in the hope that maybe somebody here will want to take it up and deal with it. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Questions?
We will take some questions, but I would like to start with one question of myself. Could you say a few words about legislation in Israel and maybe in the Palestinian authorities regarding incitement?
Israel has legislation regarding incitement to violence and incitement to terror, and our courts, as was said at the beginning, our courts are trained in establishing the balance between the right to speak, the freedom of speech, and crossing the line. And we have a lot of criticism from other countries. And I remember when I was ambassador to Canada, a lot of the Canadian political figures said, well, how can you expect us to act against terror when you yourself allow political leaders to make speeches and to demonstrate and to do what they do? And this is an issue of balancing between human rights and a violation of basic law. Now, Israel is a difficult example because Islam is an official religion in Israel. In the same way that Judaism, Jewish law, and canon law are all official religions. In other words, Sharia law is part of Israeli law. And so the situation in Israel is very complex, as it is in every context, not just here. But what we try and do is to prevent incitement to terror. The military legislation in the territories, which according to the Geneva Conventions an administering power is entitled to legislate, limits to a far greater extent than it does within Israel the rights to incite to violence.
We'll take questions from the public, please.
Since you have brought up the importance of the ideological current behind the acts of terrorism and the question of defining in international law what constitutes criminalizing incitement, I think, doesn't that raise the question as to how do you define incitement? Because in Germany, for example, there is a movement that advocates that, for example, Christian preachers should not be permitted to point out from biblical passages the message of divine warning, for example. There was another German preacher who said something about Christians having to put away their Buddha statues, for example.
Okay, well, look, I can only refer you to this document that I will leave you, where I have attempted to define incitement to commit an act of terror, and the definition is based on the intention that the incitement will cause danger, will cause violence and terror. In other words, there has to be the juncture between actual incitement and the anticipation that this incitement will result in violence and terror. I'll just read it out to you very quickly. Incitement to commit an act of terror means directly or indirectly calling upon, provoking, urging, instigating, encouraging, advocating. I apologize, this is all very legalese. Persuading others, whether groups or persons, members of the population or public at large, to initiate, organize, participate, or engage in an act or acts of terror against any person, group, or persons, or members of any religious, national, or ethnic group, where such conduct, whether or not directly advocating terrorist offenses, causes a danger that one or more of such offenses may be committed. In other words, it has to be on the assumption that it will bring about terror. Otherwise, anybody who's just making a hateful speech isn't necessarily inciting.
Could you say something about what the appropriate use of charges under crimes of treason or high treason could be in combating incitement and terrorism in general?
Difficult for me to respond to that because it depends on each individual legal system, the extent to which the jurisdiction of the local jurisdiction is covered by those very charges. And so I personally think that treason and high treason is one thing, and incitement as a result of what's been happening over the last few years has become something else, perhaps far wider, because it's It's far wider than the individual state. Treason is against a particular state. Incitement is against humanity, and as we're seeing more and more, it's becoming wider and wider geographically, and it's not just limited to killing Israelis or killing Jews, or anyway, it's killing everybody. It's killing any non-believer, and tragically, a lot of ISIS is conducting campaigns against Muslims who don't support their own particular fanatical brand.
Thank you very much. When you were talking about national liberation movements and the incitement that they commit, when international organizations will condemn such actions and such incitement, do they not make themselves a very easy target for these groups that they could use as a political means to gain a larger following? Because if you condemn the incitement that these political movements commit, they will speak out against that. It will be a means for them to profile themselves against Europe and the UN. And is that not giving in some way or form?
But you see, this is exactly the type of the problem that I think we're seeing with the statements by the Secretary General of the UN, that we must be very careful, we must be politically correct, because if we be overly assertive, then we're liable to annoy them, and it will be translated into more terror. This is the dilemma. What I'm saying is that there's no room for this political correctness anymore. This political correctness is being misinterpreted. And you know what? I once told a group of American senators that visited Israel, who were quite surprised when they visited Gaza and saw children running around without shoes. And they said, how could this be? This is terrible. So I tried to explain to them. I said, look, Bedouin children, this is the way they live. You don't see it in the United States, and you think everything should be measured in accordance with the standards that you have in your home. Not everybody are Americans, not everybody have high standards. And it's the same here. The messages that are coming out of the international community of political correctness and understanding the causes and the reasons is correct. This political correctness is correct, but it's misinterpreted as a message. It's as if the international community is giving a green light to say, go ahead, you're doing something right, because we're not going to come down against you. And so my message here is this type of political correctness, whether it's Margareta Mogherini or whatever her name is, or Barack Obama or anybody else, in my opinion, it's naive. It's not mistaken, because as I quoted, the Israeli Supreme Court was the first to come out and say we have to take into consideration human rights norms. And Israeli law is based on human rights norms, and we have to do this. But we have to be very careful how things are interpreted by the various jihadist elements. And in my opinion, they're being misinterpreted, and here there should be some element of education among the leadership of the international community.
Mr. Baker, thank you. I have a question on hate preaching. I'm with the American Jewish Committee in Brussels, and we've been advocating for a while now with our European interlocutors the notion that free societies should only allow financing of education, including religious education, from other free societies. So the Freedom House list decides or identifies free countries and less free countries or non-free countries. And we would say if all democracies, yes, question, if all democracies limit financing of religious institutions to those countries which are on the free countries list of Freedom House, do you think that would be a useful measure to limit or counter hate preaching and incitement? Thank you.
Look, this is a very difficult question, because you're entering into international politics, and I'm still an ambassador. I still have the title of ambassador, but I'm no longer a diplomat, and therefore I can be less diplomatic in saying that, for instance, in the hall on the other side of this building, where there's a meeting of the Netherlands Libyan Economic Council or whatever, Libya is on this Freedom House list as a country that doesn't permit freedom. And so, look, every country has to determine where its political, security, financial, economic interests are. And I personally think it will be very difficult to establish a general rule that countries will agree to and accept if there's the chance that it might harm their oil interests or their economic interests.
I was wondering, why did you decide to try to get a treaty on incitement to terrorism before there is a workable treaty defining terrorism? Shouldn't that come first?
Well, look, as I said, there are definitions of terrorism, and as far as I know, the Council of State parties of the International Criminal Court have agreed upon, or already adopted, or are about to adopt, an accepted definition of terrorism to insert into the statute of the International Criminal Court. So I think it will be there. But let me just refer to another point. I've drafted also an international convention criminalizing anti-Semitism. Why? Because after thousands and thousands of years and thousands and millions of Jews that have been murdered throughout the world, there's no crime, there's no international crime of anti-Semitism. There's crimes of piracy, there's crimes of hostage-taking, there are all sorts of crimes of terrorism, but anti-Semitism has never been determined an international crime that the International Criminal Court can deal with. And so I'll also leave you copies of this. I drafted an international convention. But it's, we have to understand that we're talking about international law here, but international law is not a strict system of law. It's a system of law based on voluntary willingness to become party or not become party. If you're a huge superpower, you really don't need to take into consideration anything, and you can do what you want. If you're a small state like Israel or the Netherlands, then you have to abide by international obligations, and we find ourselves all the time accused of not abiding, and this is an ongoing argument, especially people like me, lawyers, we're dealing with all the time. But international law, in principle, is not a strict legal system. You can't arrest somebody and put him in prison and force him to come to trial. It doesn't exist. It has to be based on a willingness of states to oblige themselves, or, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, a willingness to limit one's rights. When you go to an airport and you take your shoes off and you take off your belt and risk losing your trousers, you do this because you do this willingly, because you know that this is good for security, and if everybody faces the same requirements, then you feel safer. This is the modus operandi of El Al, Israel's airlines, that it has strict security that annoys everybody, but ultimately everybody's happy with it because they know that it applies to everybody. The same with international law. As soon as states realize that it's good for the general community and for them as well, then maybe we'll get stricter international conventions with teeth that you can bring offending states to trial.
Okay, Mr. Baker, thank you very much.
You're
I
welcome.
think we can add to our... I would like to add to our balancing act, so to speak, the question of what is politically correct and what is really correct, and how do we deal with speech which can be discriminating but still sometimes needed, right?
Right.
This is one your message. Do I understand well, do you also say that international law always deals with terror and other offensive attacks after they have happened and they solve the problem which has already occurred?
Well, this is international law. Look, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 were drafted after the after the Second World War, in order to deal with the problems that cropped up during the Second World War. The 1977 protocols to the Geneva Convention were drafted after Vietnam to deal with the issues that cropped up, the technological developments of warfare. The 1990 international conventions against terrorist bombings and things like that, or nuclear terrorism, are all based on developments that have already taken place in means of warfare and means of fighting. So international law inevitably follows on from events. I also, I've got this weakness that from experience of drafting international conventions. So I'd also drafted an international convention against suicide bombing. The only problem was that you can't bring the offender to trial because he's dead already. But you can bring the driver that brought him to the place, or the person that gave him his sandwiches before he blew himself up. And I tried to sell this, and the Russians were very interested in developing it. But again, states might like these things, but they might even take them up, but they don't really do very much afterwards.
Thank you very much. I think the conclusion should be that politicians and politics still have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely.
Okay.